Tough question this morning for you, and I think we've all probably asked it before, and that is essentially, does prayer really work? Does God answer prayer? And for those of you who have been praying and asking and pursuing, and months have turned into years, and years have turned into decades, it's a challenging question to answer. Does God answer our prayers? Is God responsive to what we're asking Him? Does God hear what we're saying? Is what we're saying getting through to Him? Is what we're saying and expressing to Him hitting the ceiling, coming back at us? Does God really oversee sovereignly the universe? Does our persistence in prayer really pay off? If you have been pursuing God, praying for a healing mentally, physically, relationally, emotionally, and you still are waiting. If you have asked God over the years to intervene because you have a loved one that you know He wants to rescue and save, but they continue to do their own thing separate from God, and you're pleading with Him, God, find them, chase them, pursue them, arrest them, wake them up, draw them near, and they continue to labor in self-reliance and independence and doing their own thing separate from God, it can bring us to some serious questions about whether or not God's hearing our prayers and whether or not He answers prayers. And if you've been waiting for some kind of intervention from God over time, it's very easy to wonder, if I continue to ask God for relief from this anxiety and this depression, deliverance from addiction, and it continues on and on and on, does my prayer really make a difference? Does anybody's prayer really make a difference? Why does God answer prayer? Is He answering prayer for His own glory, or is He really answering prayer for my good? And if He was answering prayer for my good, wouldn't He be doing and giving and healing and all of the things that I'm asking for that seem to make so much sense? It seems to be in line with what He wants. It's God's will that none would perish. Well, I have people I love that are perishing separate from God. I would like Him to rescue them. What's the holdup? Does God not answer prayer? Is He not responsive to my prayer? If you have a little one in your house that keeps praying for the same thing night after night and day after day, and you're trying to figure out what to say to your little one who keeps asking and keeps asking and keeps asking, it's a tough burden to try to explain why what they're asking God still hasn't happened in their life or in their grandpa's life and grandma's life or their neighbor's life or their friend's life or their own life. Does God change the course of history, human history, because we pray? Does He do that because we pray, and does the history change because we don't pray? I mean, these are reasonable questions about prayer. These are reasonable questions about talking to the Father in heaven. Does God truly care about me? Does He truly care about my personal desires? Does He truly care about what I'm praying for? Scott McKnight, well-known author, commentator, professor, biblical scholar, says prayer always faces a few problems. Always. Not the least being whether God, the God of the cosmos, and even beyond, whether or not He really cares about my personal petitions. Theologians recognize the tension around prayer, answered prayer, and requesting prayer, and depending on God for prayer. Jesus' teachings on the Sermon on the Mount confronts this question, answers this question, describes how to think about this question, cultivates an attitude about this question. And Jesus essentially says this: in my kingdom, prayer is not a button to be pushed, it's a relationship to be pursued. And for button-pushing American Christians, this is a tough one. It's a tough one. We like to push our buttons and get what we're expecting. I mean, if you have any doubts as to whether or not we want what we want, try to think of the last response that you had at a retail coffee shop or a restaurant where you asked for something, didn't get it, and had to control your temper. You had to say, calm down, it's pancakes, calm down, it's a latte, relax. Because we tend to be people who have become accustomed to and learned to expect that if we push the right buttons, we get the right requests. We get the right responses. And here's what Jesus is going to show us. He's going to show us that in his kingdom there is prayer, but you have to make a distinction between prayer being a button that you're pushing, that you're making requests and God's responding to those requests, and the difference between that and a relationship to be pursued. And Jesus starts to describe how we can see prayer, how we can view prayer, how we can adjust our attitude about prayer, where he basically says it's childlike trust. Childlike, different from childish, right? Childish is demanding, self-centered, and impatient. Childlike trust that leads us to see that God is a Father who is infinitely good. And that childlike trust helps us see that God will respond to his people when they pray. And if you don't get this, then I know for a fact, I know this is true. If you don't get this, if you don't absorb this today, that it'll continue to drain you of your power for prayer and power in prayer to believe that you're pushing the right buttons and you're not seeing the right answers. Very, very likely that your power for prayer will drain out. And it will become labor, heavy, heavy labor. So how does Jesus teach his disciples? How does he teach his disciples to pray? Here's what he says. Be persistent in pursuing God in prayer. Be persistent. It's incredible that on the Sermon on the Mount, one of the first things that Jesus says about prayer is, he says, pray like this. In other words, there is a way in which he helps us and teaches us and shapes us to pray. Our Father who's in heaven, your name is holy and matchless and above all names. And he goes on and teaches kind of a format for how to approach prayer specifically. And then, secondly, in the Sermon on the Mount, he kind of reveals to us an attitude about prayer and helps us kind of picture and learn. But there's reasons why that we aren't necessarily persistent in pursuing God in prayer. There's reasons why. And I think there's two main discouragements. The main discouragement in persistent prayer is unanswered prayer. Now, I'd love to hear from you. You guys hear from me every Sunday. I'd love to hear from you. How many of you have faced a period of time in your life? It could be a day, longer. It could be years, decades, where you have experienced the discouragement of unanswered prayer. Where are you? Where are you? The discouragement of unanswered prayer. And sometimes that leads us to say, I'm not sure I'm going to keep this up. I'm not sure I'm going to keep this up. In other words, it's getting hard to be persistent. Sometimes we ask God for something and it doesn't matter that much. I remember the first time that I experienced unanswered prayer, I was in my adolescence, and my first unanswered prayers, now these are very surface prayers, but I was still wrestling with how much it matters to an adolescent when I remember praying, God, I have this crush on this girl. And here was my prayer. Take this cup of suffering from me. Take this crush away from me. She doesn't know I exist. Well, I'll spare you the details. That was one of my unanswered prayers. God, I need you to take these feelings away. Anyone else ever pray a take these feelings away prayer? I feel these feels, take them away. Then I remember praying the take these allergies away prayer. Suffering with allergies, it got more and more interruptive in my life and in my activity level and so on. And as an adolescent, as it got worse and worse, I remember focusing in more and more on God, please, would you just kind of intervene and heal and deliver me from these allergies. Funny story, I got down to school in Tulsa, my very first semester at school in Tulsa. Down south, really dry, right? Sunny, weather was life-altering, but I remember after a couple of months, I remember corresponding with my mom and dad saying, "You're not going to believe this. All these years we've been praying that God would heal me of these allergies. Guess what he did down here in Tulsa? He healed me of my allergies, and we celebrated. Then I came back for fall break, right back here to Central New York, and God was like, that wasn't a healing. You just moved down to the dry south, and now, boom, there it is, all my allergies, all back." And realized he didn't heal me in Tulsa. The weather healed me in Tulsa. And I labored longer for my entire early adult life with allergies and continued to pray that God would take them away. And then I remember there were times in my late adolescence desperately praying that God would take this spiritual apathy away. Now, these are surface prayers, right? Take this crush away, take these allergies away, take this apathy away. But some of you, you're not praying surface prayers anymore because life has gotten too real. Life has gotten really hard. And life has dealt you some difficult hands that have been hard to swallow and hard to overcome. And you're not praying surface prayers anymore. You're praying for the conversion of a spouse who you're desperately hoping, praying, and waiting for God to intervene. Some of you have been praying for a devastating medical diagnosis, and your life has been altered and is carrying all kinds of unbearable burdens because of what your body is doing and the way that it is diseased or the way that it has been challenged, and you are desperately asking God for some relief, just any kind of relief, some change in your physical body, circumstances, or situation. Some of you have been praying for physical, mental, emotional healing or intervention or rescue or some kind of deliverance. I know others have been praying for a long time for a different, new kind of gainful employment. You recognize and in some ways feel the heavy burden of employment that is withering and wearying to you and your family. And you are open to and waiting for and hoping that God will give you new direction and a new purpose and new vision, a new place to plug in and contribute to culture and society with new work. And I know there's still so many of you that carry the burden of seeing and sensing the injustice in the world, the injustice maybe at your workplace or at your school or on your team or among your neighborhood or wherever the cause is that you're involved in, and you say this injustice, especially the injustice being perpetrated on the innocent, it needs to change. Where's God? I'm praying for that. Intervene, flip, do something, confront, God heal, do something, break in somehow. And when we go to God repeatedly, and we get before him, and we do this for years, and we do this on heart-level issues, God can seem distant, uninterested, apathetic. And God goes, when he goes radio silent, and that person we've been praying for, that God would intervene and bring healing to their body, passes away. When we've been praying for our lost family member, parent, child, spouse, and before God seems to intervene, they pass away. When someone is dying before conversion or before healing or life gets damaged because of some unemployment or some addiction or some abuse, it can be discouraging to continue on persevering in prayer. Very difficult and very heavy and very confusing for us to continue on. And there's answers, right? We've heard these answers, and I think these answers, though true, aren't very satisfying when we're experiencing this. Though true, aren't very satisfying, right? Which, of course, is answers or explanations like this. And while we're in crisis, this doesn't really make us feel any better. So I would certainly advise that if any of you are dealing and helping and loving someone who's in crisis, this isn't the time to push back on their questions about prayer. We don't deliver them the short answers, even if they're true, right? We have to be careful that though it's true that God always answers us, but rarely in the way that we want him to or expect him to, that often doesn't comfort us in crisis. It's also true that we're to keep on praying. It's also true that it's possible that we are asking and wanting something that's out of God's will. It's not His plan. It's also true that while we're praying, God is molding and bending and shaping our will to His. That's true, but also isn't very comforting when we're trying to figure out how could His will possibly be this outcome? How is that possible? It's also true that oftentimes we really don't want what we're asking. It's also true that our motives are impure. And we've heard this one. God has 3 answers to our prayers. He's got yes, no. Anyone know the third one? Just wait. Just wait. That's everyone's favorite, right? Sarcastically, that's everyone's favorite. These sometimes, though true, don't really reach that deep into our hearts. They don't give us what we're needing at the moment, even though they're no less true. When we are aching for God to act. If you're with us here this morning among our church family, or you're tuned in online somehow, somewhere, I want you to know that we recognize and we're with you in the waiting and in the confusion and in the sometimes the suffering of facing the hardship or just the unknown circumstances, waiting for God to say, do, and intervene somehow, some way. We're with you. You're not facing that alone. And by the way, if you're with a group of people, someone else feels the same way. Someone else has just got a devastating diagnosis as well, or someone else is dealing with something very similar. Sometimes our hope that God is going to intervene lags behind our petition prayer. Our hope comes after we continue to petition God in prayer. Sometimes our hope is what's sustaining us. That's why we continue to pray, because we still have some hope. The second discouragement is this: if God knows everything ahead of time, infinitely aware of everything, and He knows what you're going to say and pray before you say it and pray it, has anyone ever wondered, well, why bother? Why bother? Right? Any of you husbands would get out of date night conversation if you knew that your wife already knew what you were going to say before you said it, and you'd be like, well, then she's way ahead of me. She's way ahead of me. Or conversations with kids and bosses and coworkers, and you're kind of like, I don't know why we have these conversations if I'm only ever telling them something they already know. And when you think about this, it makes only partial sense, right? But some gifts are surprises. But often gifts come as a result of asking. If you have someone that you know, love, and spend time with, maybe some people that you care about in your own life, oftentimes you're surprised with a gift. Other times they know that you've requested a gift. Those gifts are no less special, no less meaningful. And those who love other people often ask one another for things. They often have a dialogue. They often have an exchange. So God invites us to ask. And sure, He knows ahead of time, but He also wants us to interact and do the asking, do the talking, do the sharing, do the expressing. And we do that out of our love for the Father. And we petition and pursue Him out of our love for the Father. And we can assume that God both knows what we want and also wants to know what we want. Isn't that fair? That God knows what you want, but He also wants to hear you say it. He wants to hear you process it, and He wants to hear you dialogue. And He wants to be with you, and He wants you to depend on Him. So, the broad summary of the Bible on prayer. When we look at the broad summary as the Bible kind of covers prayer and how prayer works, it teaches us that God, in His sovereignty, this is mind-boggling, He establishes a kind of contingency in the universe. This is kind of what I've learned over the years, which means He genuinely interacts with humans who pray in such a way that the universe changes because of our prayer. In other words, He doesn't turn control of the universe over to us in our prayers. Anyone else relieved at that? I am often relieved. Like, God answers your prayers, and God does what you ask, and God responds to praying people, and I'm like, oh God, I hope He hasn't just given us the wheel. But instead, there's this contingency where He works with us to alter and change the course of life and history in the universe, but He does it in some kind of collaboration and cooperation with praying people. And one example of that, you can study this on your own, is Jonah and Nineveh. God's going to save Nineveh. He includes Jonah, and he's like, get to it. I want you to share and pray and share and pray. God's going to save Nineveh, but he brings in Jonah to be a part of that process of altering the course of the Ninevites, even though Jonah eventually gets mad about it and pouts. Great story, but a great picture of looking at the results of our prayers. So what could be persistent in pursuing God in prayer? What could that possibly mean? What could that possibly mean? Here's Jesus' own words. Keep on asking. Keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open to you. I want you to take a look at the very first two words of each of those phrases. Keep on, keep on, keep on. That's the repetitive part of this kind of teaching here, is if you do the asking, the seeking, and the knocking, you're going to receive, and you're going to find, and you're going to see that things are open to you. And Jesus defines prayer here as a burning pursuit of knowing God. He defines prayer here as a divinely empowered response to God's open invitation. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Seek and find, but keep on and be persistent. Now, why pursue God in prayer? Here's what we learn in this Sermon on the Mount. We persist in prayer because every sincere disciple is pursuing an infinitely good giver. We're persevering in prayer because we are praying to someone who is infinitely good, and they're an infinitely good giver. In other words, we continue to approach God because of who he is. Right? Be persistent in prayer because who are you pursuing in prayer? Someone who is good at an infinite scale. Even though that's so hard for us to measure in our tiny little brains, and it's hard for us to comprehend. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks the door will be open. Now, why does Jesus need to say this with such concrete words, right? This doesn't seem like Jesus says, look at, you're going to be asking, seeking, and knocking, and sometimes it's not going to happen. Why doesn't he say that? What is he doing? Why is it so confusing? Jesus is using words that are so concrete. You will receive, you will find, and the door will be opened. Emphatic, concrete. It will happen. And then what happens? We live our lives, and things like this don't happen in a concrete way. And what do we start doing? Do we start doubting ourselves? We don't start doubting ourselves. We're like, I'm not sure God has portrayed himself accurately. I'm not sure that he has expressed himself accurately because my experience doesn't match Jesus' words. Keep this in mind, that what Jesus is confronting is this idea that Yahweh, this God of the universe, who when you approach and when you talk to, if you were to do it on your own, you would drop dead. He is teaching his disciples that this God of the universe, who controls all things and has completely smite nations and people groups and cities, this God that you're praying to, he's approachable. He's personal. He is available to you. And Jesus, of course, is teaching, well, listen, this God is not a magic genie. This God is not a magic genie that's granting your personal wishes, making a promise to everyone to just keep asking and they're going to get everything they want. I mean, on a side note, we know what we call kids who end up getting everything they want, right? What are they? They are spoiled. Some of you would go even further. Spoiled. See, I knew you would. I knew you'd go further. Spoiled brats. What makes a kid a spoiled brat? They get everything they want, everything they ask for, anything that they demand. And if we're a child of God, it's likely that we will request and demand and expect and hope for and pray for things that aren't good for us. And only in God's cosmic wisdom would he be able to interpret that for us. So Jesus is saying, look, I want you to know, our Father is not a magic genie granting all of our wishes. But on the other hand, keep this in mind. Jesus is saying, I am pushing back on the prevailing idea that God is only distant, impersonal deity. I am pushing back on the idea that God is out there, far out, and you have to approach him in kind of a holy of holies, and you have to be kind of cleansed and sanctified in the ceremony, and then the priest approaches him, and by God's mercy, he doesn't wipe him out. What Jesus is saying is, we have a heavenly Father now who is personal, and he can be approached, and he can be approached with everything you care about. Everything you desire, and you can continue. Everyone who sincerely asks will find that they are receiving who? They're receiving Jesus and the God of the universe. Everyone who seeks Jesus and the God of the universe is going to find him. Everyone who sincerely knocks, the door will be opened to them, and they will be ushered into the presence of God as they pray a prayer of desperate repentance and rescue. Everyone who sincerely does that, as God is working deeply in their heart. Jesus is pushing back on the idea that God the Father in heaven doesn't care, that God the Father doesn't hear you. Worse, he's pushing back on the idea that no one can find him because he's hiding himself from us. Jesus is saying it is not true that God is hiding from you. It is not true that God is trying to elude what you need and what you're asking and what your questions are even. Instead, Jesus is addressing doubting disciples, and they need to be assured. And Jesus uses this hyperbole language to reassure them that God indeed loves them and that they can trust God to hear their every desire. That's what he's saying. There is a concreteness that says, despite your error, despite the false view that you have of the Father in heaven, it's not true. If you sincerely approach him and you say, God, I am seeking you, I am desiring you, I'm knocking on your door, God will make himself known to you. And he does so most vividly and beautifully in all his glory in Jesus. He can be discovered. And you can pursue God by pursuing Jesus. Jesus wasn't naive, by the way. I don't know if this has ever occurred to you, but this was part of Jesus's hyperbole rhetoric, and he knew that his own disciples prayed and that they didn't get what they wanted. Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that the disciples were asking for things and it wasn't happening.